Welcome to the France 24 debate. In the wake of the Munich Security Conference, we consider what happens next. With the major problem, Russia's war on Ukraine, still unresolved, will the words of Munich mean a row of beans to anyone right now struggling to feed themselves, stay warm and, of course, stay alive under Vladimir Putin's continued missile and drone attacks? And, of course, with that, the lack of concern for human life. On the issue of European security, already Germany is putting pressure on France to increase its defence spending. Germany's Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul essentially telling Emmanuel Macron to put his money where his mouth is. Would it were that simple? France, of course, has a massive public debt crisis and needs a clever fix to find that 5% of GDP for the NATO spend. Well, this Monday, Marco Rubio is visiting Budapest, a fine city. His mission is to take a message of support from US President Trump to his, as we are led to believe, friend, Viktor Orbán. Orbán is Vladimir Putin's biggest admirer in the EU and a thorn in the side of those who are trying to do more for Ukraine and its survival, and less for Russia and its illegal expansion ambitions. Rubio's words at the Munich Security Conference suggested more conciliation. This Monday, though, there he is, side by side with Putin's guy in Europe. What should we read into this? A bigger and bigger gap between the US and the EU, perhaps? The panel for this debate, let me introduce them. In the studio, Andrei Dietrich, who is a senior analyst on Russia and at the European Institute for Security Studies. Andrei, thanks for being with us. Pleasure to meet you. On the other side of the studio is Hélène Conway-Mouret, frequent visitor to our shores, French senator, vice chair of the Foreign Affairs Defence Committee, and just back from Munich. Tell us about that in a moment, Hélène. Great to see you, as always. In Washington, James J. Townsend Jr., Atlantic Council Senior Advisor on the Scowcroft Centre's Transatlantic Security Initiative. James, can't wait to hear what you've got to say. Let's, though, remind you before we let the panel loose about who said what in Munich. This from Antonia Kerrigan.
Hosting world leaders in Munich at an annual security conference, Chancellor Friedrich Merz lost no time in addressing the elephant in the room.
A deep divide has opened up between Europe and the United States of America. Today, the transatlantic partnership is no longer self-evident. First in the United States, then here in Europe, and probably also here in this room.
He upbraided his European allies for depending on the United States so much for so long and cautioned against importing MAGA politics onto the continent, which was exactly what Secretary of State Marco Rubio invited the assembled company to do. Referencing Dante and Shakespeare, he described the United States as a child of Europe and called on his allies to join Trump's America in deterring what he called civilizational decline.
Mass migration isn't some fringe concern of little consequence. It was and continues to be a crisis which is transforming and destabilizing societies all across the West. We made these mistakes together.
Stressing that the two powers belonged together, his rhetoric contrasted with that of J.D. Vance a year earlier, a relief for his allies. But just weeks after they prepared to defend Greenland against US annexation, the Danish PM was not convinced the danger had passed. And as US-led ceasefire talks on Ukraine drag on, Europeans were also acutely conscious that Trump's Washington does not share their fears about the threat posed by Russia.
The Americans often return to the topic of concessions, and too often those concessions are discussed in the context only of Ukraine, not Russia. Europe is practically not present at the table. It's a big mistake to my mind.
Saturday also saw the release of an investigation by 5 European states into the death of Russian dissident Alexei Navalny, findings which point the finger at a Russian poisoning plot.
Antonia Kerrigan setting the scene, the Munich Security Conference over. Marco Rubio in Budapest. Our panellists here ready to talk about the situation. Andrei, I'll give you first go at this one because we haven't worked together and I promised you an open floor to start. So what is your take about what we saw in Munich and the situation we see going forward? Where do you think we go from here?
Right. So to me, as an observer, Munich was a lot about the transatlantic alliance. For a major security conference, the biggest one on the continent, there was perhaps not that much decided or even discussed in depth when it came to to the war, Russian war on Ukraine, but maybe we will get to that point later on. And I think sort of all eyes of those present and those watching from afar were on Marco Rubio's speech. And I think there were sort of two very distinct messages that came from the US administration. The first was actually not by Rubio, but by Elbridge Colby, right? Who said, look, well, values change. Maybe we don't share the values anymore, so let's not build our alliance on the values, but on the interest. But I think there's a problem with that argument, right? Because I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding that we keep sort of perpetuating the public debate that values and interests are something very different, right? I think interest always is something that stems from values. And then as we are seeing this administration, perhaps in particular, interest also changed. So it's maybe not that stable a foundation. And then Marco Rubio actually offered sort of a value framework for Europeans to continue to build the alliance, to sustain the alliance. But I'm not so sure that it's acceptable to a majority of Europeans. Some, perhaps, but maybe not all, because it was not as adversarial as J.D. Vance's speech, last year, and the language that somehow percolated into the national security strategy, perhaps, as well. But it was very much conditioned on accepting a certain vision, so this kind of civilizational vision of this kind of common destiny, right, of the West. That we sort of garnered standing ovation, right? But it's the we who did the same mistakes, in the 90s, free trade, migration, deindustrialization, and we, the MAGA, in the US, are not sort of rectifying those mistakes, and so should you. But I think that between these two messages, it's not such a comfortable spot for many Europeans, and not easy to pick one.
Indeed. And you mentioned Ukraine, and don't be afraid to mention Ukraine, because Ukraine is central to what we're talking about tonight. People there, I imagine, watching, listening,
Absolutely.
and not getting anything that really makes them feel all that more confident about what happens going forward. Andre, thanks for that. Ellen, can I bring you in, because you were at the conference in Munich. What have you brought back with you in terms of feelings about what was said?
Well, very mixed feelings. Not the hangover that I had last year and took me weeks to recover from J.D. Vance's speech, because it came as a rupture. I've been attending the Munich Security Conference for years, and it's about common interests and common values. And last year, we very distinctly realized that it was about American interest first and European values that were different. And that, in fact, there was a gap, and it's a gap that's getting bigger, because the MAGA movement is there, I think, to continue. Marco Rubio had a much softer approach, and the standing ovation was not to what he had said, but I picked up, because I was there, a sense of relief that it was not as bad or worse, because that was expected, and there were a lot of talks in advance as to what he was going to say, given that last year Mr. Vance met with the AfD prior to the meeting, refusing to meet with the democratically elected chancellor. And Marco Rubio this year is meeting with Mr. Orbán, who is indeed Mr. Putin's friend, if Mr. Putin has friends among Europeans. So we see a political agenda from the MAGA movement, which goes counter to what we are, to what we stand for, which is anti-European. And the NSS has been, I mean, it is put in writing, the criticism against the European Union. Mr. Trump keeps also, repeating that he, we are just at the opposite of what he stands for and what he believes our civilization should be. And I think, while a lot of our European partners, when I say that France European partners, are concentrating mainly on defense and security issues, because that's what the conference is about, and having this fear that the Americans may leave us too rapidly or too abruptly, and that we're going to be there left on our own, standing on our own, they do not concentrate on the main issue for me, which is the political one, because we can be undermined from within by having extreme right regimes or governments coming into power. And if they do, that's the end of the union, and that's the end of, indeed, and I share totally what you have said, the values we stand for. I mean, talking about free speech coming from the Americans, who are 58 on the list today, when the European Union is on the second place. I mean, we don't have lessons to be given by the Americans on that. And yet, I think the political agenda is the one that we should be very worried about. We have Mr. Putin with his threat, but we have, on the other side, the Americans with a different one. And both converge for different purposes. One is territorial, the other one is political, but they converge on making the Europeans weaker, for us maybe to end up being the playing ground for the main powers in the future. We are good customers, and I've said to a few American senators who were there, because there was a large American delegation, as there is every year. Well, if you make us weak, indeed we need to purchase, and that's what you want. You want us to purchase American equipment. Fair enough. But what do we purchase it with if our purchasing power is decreasing because you keep banging us on the head? And of course, the strength of the European Union is in being in this unity, because be it Russia or America or China, if they deal with any European country on their own, of course we do not stand up to anybody. But as a continent, 500 million, we do. And we do have a financial power which is unequaled, and we have a lot that we're still unaware of, that we are still reluctant to use, but we do have it. And that's what these powers are at. It's to break up this continent as a united one.
I hear what you're saying completely. And I know that Keir Starmer agrees with you in the UK. He's trying to get sort of links a little bit closer, coming back towards...
But that's the European continent. That's why,
over. Yeah,
that's why the European Union is one entity, and it has a financial power, and it has loads of things. But we need to consider the European continent, which Britain, Norway, whatever status those countries have, within NATO or not, within the EU or not, it's not. It's 500 million on that continent, and if that continent is under pressure, if it's attacked on its eastern flank, well, it's all of us. It's going to involve all of us, not just those that are at the border.
Helen, can I pause you there for a second? Because I know that James J. Townsend Jr. is itching to join the debate. James, pleasure to have you on board as always, from the Atlantic Council, Senior Advisor on the Scowcroft Centre's Transatlantic Security Initiative. James, your opening remarks, sir, over to you. Tell us your sense of what Munich means. You've heard what the guests have said so far. Give us your sense of it.
Well, I think your guests have said so much that I agree with. I was trying to find something to really make this into a debate, and I really can't. I have also gone to the Munich Security Conference for many years when I was in the Pentagon. I worked in the Pentagon for about 35 years, mainly on Europe and NATO. So I'm very familiar with what the old order looked like, the old relationship between the U.S. and Europe, and how NATO operated. Very familiar with that, and familiar with how that was discussed at Munich. And since leaving the Pentagon, when Trump was elected the first time, that's when I went into the think tank world and to what I'm doing now. It's been a roller coaster ride to watch what's happening now. And so I think when I look back on Munich over the past couple of days, Marco Rubio, he said the same thing that J.D. Vance said. He echoed the national security strategy, the national defense strategy. He and Elbridge Colby, or Bridge as he's called around here, Bridge Colby, they were also very linked up in what they said too. So I call it old wine in a new bottle. The new bottle being a softer tone that Marco Rubio brought to his discussion. There's a softer tone. He used language in other ways that were kind of soothing. But if you read the transcript and you go through and pick out some of those words, it's still this puzzle of this MAGA impact on Europe and this drive by the administration to rescue Europe from itself culturally. And it's something that I don't know what this is going to look like in terms of how we're going to impact European politics. And I think my colleagues talked about the French elections. We have Marco Rubio in Budapest putting his finger on the scale there for Orbán of all people. So I think really, the fact that he went on to Slovakia and also to Budapest after this meeting, after giving that speech, that really shows his true colors and the administration's true colors. I think in this town, in Washington right now, certainly within the Beltway, there are so many people who looked on Marco Rubio as becoming Secretary of State as the adult in the room. That was from the first Trump term where we always wanted an adult there. And Marco Rubio represented someone who understood Europe. I remember sitting next to him at the Munich Security Conference years ago. I thought he was an intern. He looked so young. I think he must have just been elected. And so we all felt that he was in a good place to help deal with what the administration wants to do. And so I think within the Beltway now, certainly after what we heard and what we've seen in terms of these trips, there's a lot of people who are checking their assumptions now about where Marco Rubio is in all of this. And just another point for us all to think about. There's a struggle going on between Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance in terms of who's going to be the anointed one to run for president. Who will Trump turn to and say, you are my successor? And so it's be interesting to figure out what Marco Rubio is really thinking. Because right now he's really talking to an audience of one in a lot of ways, and that audience is Donald Trump. So I think for me, and I'll just end here, I think for me, I'm really interested in how Europe now deals with this. This is Europe's moment now to break a dependency that there has been in terms of security and to begin to come together, as my colleagues have said, to really make a strong Europe, not just in terms of defense, but in terms of whether it's dealing with the United States on tech, whether it's dealing with China, how it deals within Europe in terms of trying to make the EU work better and to be stronger economically. This is Europe's moment to take what the U.S. is throwing your way and to move forward into a Europe that I think becomes a partner and not a supplicant to the United States.
James, thank you very much indeed. A partner, not a supplicant to the United States. Andre, take it from there.
Sure, I think this is what, when I listen to what Emmanuel Macron says or Friedrich Merz, I think this is increasingly becoming sort of the line. It will take time to get there. I think in Europe, what I see is still a variety of positions. It's normal. I mean, we are a plural community of states, of political persuasions, but we I think differ on this fundamental question, right? Whether we can do without the American support in the short term, so we have to continue to placate Americans or this particular administration, or we take the let's say a firmer stance, whether we should appease. That word is obviously highly politically loaded, but so we are still having these sort of tactical discussions, but I think the overall consensus is that we are undergoing a serious crisis. It's not pretty, but it has the potential to actually make us change and become more independent. And I think it's a high time. And the way I see it, I mean, the U.S. has been shifting geopolitically, perhaps slow pace ever since the end of the Cold War, and then since excuse me, since the end of the first decade of the 21st century, this administration perhaps is accelerating that process. They say they don't want to be just the caretakers of the hegemonic decline. In my view, perhaps they are accelerating that decline as well. That's a separate question. But the sign is on the wall, and it's a high time that we really get our act together. And I see signs that we are. It's going to take time, and we just need to keep the momentum. That's what I believe.
Keep the momentum. Donald Trump still wants to sell the weapons to Europe that were given to Ukraine. So Donald Trump's going to be quids in, as we say, in the King's English in the UK. Whatever happens for the US, Trump stands to make money in that way, shape or form. I'm wondering whether that will be enough to help Ukraine. Does the EU have enough collective wherewithal, money to actually make that happen? It's another issue, isn't it, I suppose. Ellen, you wanted to say something earlier?
Yeah, well, just about the budget. I mean, now it's, Europe finances 100% of the support to Ukraine, which it did not at the start of the war, which means that in a very short time, indeed, we have passed and put together instruments, financial instruments, safe, 150 billion. Who would have thought 5 years ago that Europe was going to actually put all that money on the table to move forward with defense? We put together the package of EDIP, and we are actually moving...
This happens in spite of Viktor Orbán, in spite of Robert Fico,
so
their
we are
positions.
Actually moving quite rapidly from the way we have moved so far, under huge pressure. And I think, we just need to be confident in ourselves. Now, we cannot do away with our history. We have a number of countries that gained their independence just a few decades ago, and since their independence have subcontracted their defense to the United States. A lot of them don't even have a commander-in-chief at a national level. It's NATO that does that for those countries. So if you say to these countries, tomorrow the Americans are leaving, of course there is total panic. Because, as you rightly said, we need time to come together and for these countries to do what France started doing in the 1960s, which is quite a long time ago, to decide that, yes, we're going to assume to be strategically autonomous. Strategically autonomous meant not having military personnel from the United States on the French territory, which was the case of a lot of countries, including Germany still, and to invest in nuclear deterrence. We did that at a high cost, but that was the price to pay. So it's much easier for us, of course, today to say we need to be more autonomous and so on, because we've assumed that, and we are at that level, for some time and quite comfortable with it. But we need to be aware that a lot of countries need that catching up. So what I see happening at the moment is that Europe is facilitating the move forward with money, because it does come down to that. Except that sometimes when you have too much money, you buy everything and anything off the shelf, when indeed we should be investing within Europe to boost the European economy, so that we're creating jobs, we're having countries that never had an industrial base and could have one tomorrow. But we are caught in this kind of sprint rather than marathon. And it is most unfortunate, because if we were in a marathon, I would say in 5 or 10 years' time, yes, most countries will have achieved where they need to be. And France, indeed, and it was the criticism I wanted to go back over of France not doing enough. I mean, we have a complete army and we have nuclear deterrence, which costs a lot. Now, if that was to be extended to the rest of Europe with, security guarantees, well, we would expect maybe Europe to partake in it. And then, indeed, we could invest maybe in other stuff that we do. But we are at 2%, which is the target that we had. We have an increase, and I'm rapporteur for the budget of the equipment of the French armed forces. So I have my nose in the budget and the equipment we use and have and need to purchase. We have an increase of 6.7 billion this year alone, going up to 8 and then 9 billion per year of increase on the current budget that we have. So it is not right to say we don't do enough. And we have this tendency in Europe to always look at the glass half empty. I mean, there's lots of things that we can do with the British, for instance, on the, security guarantees. The Germans are putting 100 billion on the table to bring up their army up to speed and, invest and so on. And most European countries have a part to play. I mean, the Estonians, for instance, are absolutely brilliant. I mean, the Ukrainians are showing what can actually be done in terms of innovation, research, and so on in a very constrained time. But the Estonians have so much to bring to the rest of Europe on cyber, on information, on intelligence, and so on. So, but we do need to get out of this American kind of lid that's on a lot of countries and say, yes, we have this freedom, let's do things together. And it is starting to work on the bilateral and multilateral level within Europe.
Helen,
we need to concentrate on that.
Need to concentrate on that, developing Europe, developing jobs, creating an industry, recreating a defence industry, creating that base from which you can grow defence for the whole of the continent. It starts to sound like a European army. I'll ask you that one later, because I want to go back to James in Washington and ask James whether, well, Donald Trump must be watching this and thinking, well, I stand to gain whatever happens here because I can sell the weapons, we can make the weapons, we have the market that's ready-made. Trump must be very happy.
Well, I think Trump is very happy when he looks at particularly Ukraine, and we're selling weapons instead of giving them to Ukraine. We're selling them to Europe, and Europe provides them. So he feels happy about that. But I don't think Trump is looking at Europe these days. I don't think he went to Davos, he did a speech, he was talking about Greenland in the context of the Western Hemisphere. But right now, I think Trump, in terms of foreign policy and what is he looking at, I really think he's looking to domestically right now and looking at his poll numbers and looking at the midterm elections coming up and the Epstein files, which could very well cause him some trouble as things are released. So he's looking at other things, and he is really left up to Marco Rubio, particularly, and also Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, who has not shown up to defense ministerials now twice, which shows you something as well. But I think he is now going to be focusing more on the domestic side. So we're going to be really seeing what Marco Rubio and Bridge Colby were talking about over the past few days. What we heard from them is really where the White House is, with Trump weighing in every now and then, depending on something that might trigger him in the middle of the night and make him tweet. But he's not paying a whole lot of attention to us, and I don't think he's paying a lot of attention to Ukraine either.
James, for now, thank you. We have another guest who has joined us in Munich, Grégoire Rousse, who is Director of Europe, Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. Grégoire, battling through the traffic in Munich, I understand, to get to the live position. Grégoire, I hope you can hear us. I hope you heard a little bit of what has been said here. We're looking to sort of get your sense of what Munich meant. Marco Rubio going to Budapest. Is this another echo that basically the US is moving further away from Europe in the broadest possible sense, leaving Europe to fend for itself in some way, having this kind of leaning towards the nationalists, the sort of Viktor Orbáns, the friends of Putin almost in that kind of respect? What is your sense of where we are? What is your sense of what happens beyond?
Well, much was said here in Munich about the standing ovation that Secretary Rubio got at the end of his speech. Some argued that the Europeans followed the Americans sitting on the first and second row and who immediately started to clap the standing up, and everyone else followed. This hid another reality. In all the discussions I've had with senior members of the American delegation and other Europeans, there was a real gap between the perception of the American, including some Democrats, and the Europeans who really said the speech sounded different, but the substance was pretty much the same as that of J.D. Vance last year, and we just don't buy it. So that was the first takeaway. And looking at the trip of Secretary Rubio to Hungary and Slovakia, for that matter, because he also met with Prime Minister Fico of Slovakia, one of the friends of President Trump in the region, I would have the same approach. I would look past the headline and the picture and really try to analyze what's the dynamics behind the scenes. The dynamic is that the President Trump, I'd say two things. One is that the visit is in line with the national security strategy that outlined the vision of the U.S. administration for the coming years. And it's clear that they pretend at least that they want a stronger Europe, but certainly not through the European institutions, rather through the success of hard-right populist parties. So that is in line with the national security strategy. But there is a second layer, and it's worth mentioning, is that the US administration would love to see Hungary and Slovakia reduce their dependency on Russian gas and switch to US gas alternatives. So I suspect that there are some commercial or trade items on the agenda.
Would you say, Gregoire, that for Europe now, basically it's a question of almost being, to coin a phrase, shot by both sides, because Russia on one side is looking to break up Europe, and the US, it seems, with its support and its leaning towards nationalist parties in terms of what it's trying to achieve, and of course what it's doing in terms of the market, is also equally trying to break up Europe. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I think, honestly, everyone agrees. And if you read the tweets and some of the comments of hard-right leaders across Europe, with perhaps a minor exception of the AfD in Germany, even Mr. Farage understands that, although not in the EU, the UK is faced with the challenge of being pushed too much by the US to align against China or align against Russia, and that's a real threat to their sovereignty. So yes, I do agree. And what the senator said is spot on. Many countries, if I look at the V4, so the Visegrad group, including Poland, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, of the 4 who joined the EU, 3 joined NATO before they joined the EU. So NATO and the US security umbrella will always come first. The reason I say that is that even those countries are aware that the latest developments across the Atlantic are playing against their own security interests. But at the same time, they have no other choice but to stick to, at least for now, to Washington. So we don't feel the impact the same way, depending on whether we've always had that kind of I'd say, security autonomy, all very relative, or whether one has been exclusively dependent on the US. But it's really felt across Europe. And here in Munich, all the discussions we have at Chatham House in London, when we meet with delegations from the region, behind closed doors, they confirm that it's not the most comfortable chapter in their relation with the US.
Gregoire Russe, thank you very much indeed. We'll get back to you very, very soon. The person that I always feel sorry for in these situations is Vladimir Zelensky, because he turns up, he does a great speech in English. He is dignified. He keeps his temper when I can imagine he's feeling incredibly mad inside. And he walks away still not knowing whether he's going to get what he needs to stop his country from being swallowed up by Russia. Andre, what would you do to help Ukraine? What should have been said to help Ukraine?
I'm not sure what should have been said. I think what really matters is what we do, not what we say, right?
Very good.
And just before Christmas, the EU member states agreed to this loan, 90 billion loan. And the spectacle was a bit unfortunate because the question of the frozen assets came into question. But in the end, the result for Ukraine is very, very good. And that loan is in the making of being disbursed. And it's a lot of money, 90 billion euro that EU is offering, right? So we need to follow through on that. 60 billion of that money is going to go to procure weapons, right? To make Ukraine stronger in defense against Russian aggression, this one or a potential future one. So for me, this is something very real that the EU is doing. But what Vladimir Zelensky also said in Munich is that the Europeans should be at the table, right? The negotiations. We are providing the support now to Ukraine for very good reasons, if you ask me. And we should, because it's in our very core interest to do so. I think Ukraine is and will be sort of part of the extended front line in the confrontation that we are already in with Russia. It's not our own choice, but this is the fact, and it will continue to be the fact. So it's part of the extended front line. We do support Ukraine. We should have a say in the design of any sort of future ceasefire that will freeze the hostilities. Because one of the reasons is that the moment this happens, and I think it should happen, of course, for purely human reasons, to stop the bloodshed that was unleashed by Putin's Russia, right, almost 4 years ago, right, is that the moment the reconstitution of Russian armed forces starts, right, and we need to prepare for potentiality and deter that potentiality. I don't think it's necessarily a given, but we need to do our homework to deter Russia from attacking a member state militarily.
Okay, Andrei, thank you. Ellen, I imagine that you would love to be around the table. You would like to get Ukraine into the EU as soon as possible. What would you do if you could wave that magic wand, if you could make things happen? What would you do? What would the steps that you would take?
Well, to start with, from a defense point of view, I think the Ukrainian army is today possibly the most innovative and possibly the best, having 4 years of war behind them and showing how they can resist one of the most powerful country in the world. Even though that country is showing a lot of weaknesses because they're calling upon Africans, North Koreans, and people coming from around the world to actually fight on the front line.
Just to put in what you're saying, Ukraine makes fastest battlefield gains in the last 2.5 years over the last few weeks. So Ukraine gaining ground, according to the Institute of the Study of War.
And the human loss on the Russian side is just horrendous. It's when the real figures are going to come out, it's just going to be just unbelievable that these young Russian men and the foreigners that are enrolled are being put on the front line to die. And the Ukrainians are resisting, they're fighting back, because they're, in that race with innovation. We have both a kind of very conventional, traditional war with trenches, and we have a technical war that relies upon the highest technologies in terms of the use of drones, intelligence, and what the Ukrainians did. I mean, they depleted a lot of the Air Corps, Russian Air Corps, and fleet when they don't have a fleet themselves and when they don't have an Air Corps either. But they were able to do that on Russian territory. So they're absolutely amazing. So the first step is to include them in that. Now, the other process, you're talking about the EU, I mean, that's a different setup. But there are different ways to have Ukraine as part of Europe. And as I say, the British have decided not to be part of the EU. And yet, today, the relationship between Britain and the EU is getting stronger every day because, under American pressure, the British are kind of feeling, well, maybe the Europeans are the ones we want to deal with. And, not having this dependency on the US. So I think we should not mix everything at the same time in the same way as kind of saying, but Ukraine needs to enter NATO or whatever. What we need to do is indeed help all of us for Ukraine to actually come to the table, and indeed the Europeans should be there. But why are they not there? Because they were not invited by the Americans. Because I think Donald Trump felt that with his envoy, special envoy, that he was going to pass deals with the Russians because everything is about a deal.
That was the aim. That was the game, wasn't it? Making money.
What is Gaza about? This peace council.
It's about money.
It's about money. 1 billion on the table, you join the council, and then we're going to have a holiday resort in Gaza tomorrow. So his perspectives are quite different from our long-term perspective, which is to remain in peace on this continent. And indeed, Ukraine needs to not lose that war, because if it does, indeed, there will be other countries after, because unfortunately, that's what the Russian imperialistic ambitions are today and have been very clearly expressed to us. So we need to listen and get the messages right. So we need to defend ourselves, defend Ukraine, and deter as much as we can Russia to actually approach any of us that is in Europe, wherever we are located.
I'm running short on time. I've got to go back to Washington to James before I can come back to Gregoire immediately. So James in Washington. If you could whisper in Donald Trump's ear regarding Ukraine, what would you say? You're a man of reason, you're a man of analysis. What would you say?
I would say, for God's sake, send the Tomahawks to Ukraine. Let Zelensky strike deep into Russia. Let's go after all of those shadow boats out there, the tankers that are helping to earn the money to propel Putin's war machine. We've got to put pressure on Putin. We can talk and talk and talk and go to Munich and go to Geneva and Witkoff and all of this, but right now Putin doesn't feel any desire to sit down at a table. He wants to try to duke it out on the battlefield. We've got to turn up the pressure.
Simple as that then. Send the Tomahawks and basically let Zelensky do the business.
Let Zelensky be Zelensky, give him the things that he needs, and quit siding with Putin. Trump himself is being embarrassed by this. He is being looked upon as someone who can't cut the deal. That's because his opponent across the table for the deal isn't ready to play. Let's make him play. Let's get him to the table. And let's do that by twisting his arm.
James, thank you very much indeed. Grégoire Rousse, this will be probably the final comment. There's so much more to say, but over to you, sir. To give Ukraine what it needs, its sovereign independence, its territory, its chance of not being eaten up by Russia. What would you do?
Yes, well, without the US, one cannot do much these days. I think it's crucial that Europe just confirms and says very openly that we're absolutely delighted that the US take their strategic interests so seriously. But in that case, they should understand that they will never have such a strong ally as a strong Europe, including the EU and the UK. And if they indeed like deals, like business deals in Ukraine, better to have the Ukraine at peace with strong security guarantees. So I think President Zelensky was very smart in pushing for openness regarding elections, provided that he would be able to hold elections. And for that, he would need a strong, at least 2-decade-long security guarantee. So need commitment. And the second is to make sure that the US president understands that if he prefers to partner or align with the Kremlin, he would do so with a weak partner and a weak ally. I'm not so sure it's what he would like to do. And we start now to see the uncertain, not unraveling, but weakening of the Russian economy, basically thanks to the synchronization of US and EU sanctions. So it also shows that cooperation across the Atlantic can deliver.
Grégoire Rousse, thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry that I cut across you briefly there, but you managed to keep your train of thought, and I thank you for that and for your participation in Munich. Grégoire Rousse, Director of Europe, Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. Thanks to James J. Townsend Jr. of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Centre's Transatlantic Security Initiative. Thank you to our guests here in the studio, namely Andrei Dietrich of the analyst on Russia at the European Union Institute of Security Studies. I got there in the end, sir. Thank you for being with us. Pleasure to meet you. And thanks, as ever, to Hélène Comé-Moret, French Senator and Vice Chair of the Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee here. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to you all for watching the France 24 debate. Do stay with us.